I'm Amanda Goad, an attorney with the ACLU Southern California, and I'm so excited to be here today speaking with Sam Fader and Laverne Cox from the Disclosure production team. Thank you so much for this beautiful, powerful film. And as someone who's been working for a long time on the issue of employment for trans folks, it was great both to hear about and to see in action the production model for this film, and particularly the trans filmmaker fellowships that y'all created. Can you talk a little bit about how that worked and how it might play out in future films?
Sure. I mean, from the beginning, we knew the film had to be the change that we wanted to see in storytelling, right? It had to embody those changes. And so not only was it really important that only trans people tell the story, like be the nexus of the research and the storytelling on camera, but also that behind the scenes, it was trans people informing the film as well. So we prioritized hiring trans people. And when we couldn't do that, we mentored a trans person. So we had a fellowship with, I think, about over a dozen trans people. So every key role on set, there was a trans person informing that role, whether they were the full hire or the fellow. For so many reasons, it was an incredible experience. But I think more than anything else, you see it in the product. I mean, I think you see the intimacy and the trust and the environment that we were able to create by having people with a shared experience on set. And, I think there's moments in the film where you see our participants like kind of coming to conclusions and ideas and memories in real time. And I think a lot of that is due to this environment of like-minded people with shared experience where there's where you're able to kind of really sink into a comfort that you might not be able to when you're on a set with people that you're constantly wondering what are they going to think of you? Like, are they judging you? Are they thinking transness is weird? Are you going to get misgendered? Like all these things that trans people are constantly navigating in the backs of our minds. When that goes away, not only for when you're working, how that improves your capability and it allows you to access your best skills. But when you're a participant in a film, that also allows you this comfort to explore your memories in a different way.
It's clear that the filmmakers were able to build up tremendous trust with a whole bunch of different subjects, both people who have been performing in Hollywood themselves, such as Laverne, and also so many people who are experts from other angles on film history and so forth. How did you get so many different people to open up to you and share their perspective, and in some cases share very personal stories?
I mean, well, that's what we do. That's what we do. And I think what Sam talked about in terms of creating an environment where every member of our cast felt safe to sort of be very intimate with details of their lives and personal stories that I found moving. The days that I was on set, I found myself often in tears as different cast members recalled moments from their lives and interacting with media and their relationship with their families. And I think that the safety of everywhere you look, there was a trans person. And what I want to say about our production model is that before I met Sam, I have been doing this for a very long time, and I never even conceived that it was possible to have a set and a crew of mostly trans people. I didn't really even think that was possible. And Sam presented this idea of, if we can't find a trans person for a role, we'll have a cis person mentor them. And lo and behold, it is indeed possible. And so it is a very kind of high standard that I think we've set for ourselves in the future and for other productions.
A number of the commentators in the film hone in on how race has inflected Hollywood's portrayal of transgender people over the years. Why was it important to you to address those intersectionalities?
Well, they're just there. It's very obvious. I mean, how can you talk about Judith of Bethulia, which was directed by D.W. Griffith, who is the sort of infamous director of Birth of a Nation, and not talk about gender? How can you talk about the Florida Enchantment, which is a silent film from, I think, 1914, that sort of is probably the first cinematic sex change when there's blackface in the film, as well as gender cross-dressing. So it's just there. So, so I mean, it would be remiss of us to not talk about it. And what is so beautiful, particularly about what Yancey and what Teak and what Brian brought to those discussions, was just, I learned so much. And I think that it's important for me to always remember that even as a person who's Black, that I have blind spots when it comes to race. There's so many things I'm looking for, and there are things that Brian saw when he watched The Florida Enchantment that I sort of missed or didn't consider because I was thinking of other things. And so that just speaks to having diverse voices, and it's not just about racial diversity or gender diversity; it's diversity of thought. So it's just there. It would be really sort of you can't. And I love Yancey because he was just like, well, we can't talk about Judith of Bethulia and not be very. Critical isn't the word, but very nuanced, and I guess critical is the word I would say about that it's a both and with the D.W. Griffith, right? There's Birth of Nations in very, very troubling, and continues to be, and it's sort of set the stage for so much of race, the way folks think about Black folks in the United States, and it is something that has to be talked about. And I think when we talk about film history, and now I hope when folks talk about film history, they will also be more inclusive of trans people because we've been there the whole time.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think what I think is one of the most exciting, I think one of the reasons trans people as a small movement, right? But we are such a powerful movement. And I think that is largely because we live at the intersection of every possible trait a human can have, right? Every race, class, gender, ability, religion, nationality, immigration status, age, ethnicity, sexuality, right? On and on and on. So of course that intersection is in our history and is there on screen, right? And so I think we see a lot of extraction when people tell history. For whatever reason, I mean, we could talk up for a lot about what those reasons are. I think we know what those reasons are, but honestly, that extraction is more work, right? And it's actually an act of erasure. So we were just showing what was there, right? And then having conversations about it.
There's a moment early on in the film when you, Laverne, talk about the context that you're trying to portray and the elaborate history of Hollywood having depicted people who are transgender as either not real or mentally ill. And I was struck by how that resonates with many of the arguments that we hear in the policy arena in trying to advance trans rights. Yeah. So often, whether it's a school or a prison or an employer, there's some institution that takes the position that they couldn't possibly respect trans folks' authentic identities because they're either not real or experiencing a mental illness. Yeah. And I wonder if you can speak to how changing Hollywood portrayals can influence the context in which policymakers and decision makers and the public are perceiving trans people.
I'll never forget, I think it was around late 2013, and I got a tweet from a woman who had seen me in Orange Is the New Black and said that it completely changed her idea of who trans people were. She had assumed that trans women transitioned to sort of, that was about, sort of attracting men and something like that. And she saw my character and she understood that my character was a lesbian. And I think hopefully she saw the humanity of Sophia, and she tweeted that it completely changed how she thought about trans people. I thought about another time I was in a store on Fifth Avenue. It sounds very fancy in New York, and it wasn't that fancy. There's some non-fancy stores on Fifth Avenue in the 20s in New York, and this young woman comes up to me, and she says, she's a Black woman, and she says, "Hi, I'm trans, and I saw you in Orange Is the New Black, and I just wanted to tell you." And she said, if I ever met you, I wanted to tell you that my mother saw Orange Is the New Black, and we have not spoken in years. And after she saw Orange Is the New Black, she called me. It's one of the most beautiful stories I've ever heard. And I have a lot of those kinds of stories. So it just speaks to the power of what happens when people are able to see the humanity of someone that they were not able to see before. And so I think that is the work that we must do when we tell stories as artists in Hollywood or in filmmaking and television, that the humanity and the truth of who people are is portrayed, because it can actually change people's lives. It can change the way people think about trans folks. And I think it's really about getting to know someone as a human being. And everyone does not have that opportunity. We cite the statistic, we cite it all the time, that 80% of Americans report not personally knowing someone trans. But when I think about Nicole Maines, for example, who is the beautiful young actress who is on Supergirl, and before she was on Supergirl, many years ago, she is from the state of Maine, and she fought, I believe, along with the help of the ACLU, to have access to the girls' bathroom at her school when she was a very young student. And I recall a story when the governor of the state met her and said, "Oh my God, how could I possibly have this young girl go to the boys' room?" And so he changed the law in that state. And so it's really, the opportunity that the media can provide is for folks to get to know us as human beings and see our humanity. And I think when we see the humanity of trans people, then we can understand that we're not mentally ill, and that we are indeed real, and that our identity valid. And so I think that is the possibility that can happen in media. And I think the thing I want to say about policy, though, as well, because when I see all these arguments, and I see them all the time, that are disavowing the identities of trans people and our humanity and calling us insane, I think a lot of it feels disingenuous. A lot of it feels, honestly, particularly in 2021, very desperate. It doesn't feel like it actually is coming from a real place. It feels like it really is about scapegoating trans people. It feels like it's a strange sort of power grab to sort of use trans people as this wedge issue. It feels that, Zachary Drucker in our film sort of says as much. It doesn't always feel like it's even genuine, that they really even believe what they're saying. But it just seems like it's a way to, we have to sort of use someone, because I feel like, it's the last thing I'll say. I feel like at this point, so much of what has been revealed, because it's usually people who identify as conservative, not always, but people who identify as conservative who are fighting against trans people having access to various spaces or healthcare or whatever. And I think so much around conservatism, particularly over the last few years and even in the past few weeks, has been revealed to be empty. And it has been empty for a very long time. And so I feel like they're sort of grasping for straws. And so culture war seems to be the only thing that they can grasp onto. And here we are. And that doesn't really feel quite fair. I've said many times I didn't ask to be part of a culture war. I just want to exist, And I know that's true for a lot of trans people.
The film makes clear how in the past few years, so many positive things have happened in terms of representation, largely because more and more trans people are being empowered to tell their own stories.
Yes.
And yet that is the same time period, as you were just alluding to, Laverne, when the Trump administration has been perpetrating all these new and intensified harms against the trans community. And we've seen a lot of reactionary rhetoric sort of fueled by that. And there's also been an uptick in violence. As we all painfully know, at least 44 trans people were killed in the United States last year.
Jesus.
Can you talk a little bit about the urgency of this particular story and why this was the right time to tell it?
Do you want to take that, Sam, or would you like me to?
As Laverne was talking, I was thinking about that very issue, because when we started the film, it was like, we got to make this quickly. It is so urgent. It's so timely. And then a year in, it's like, it's still really timely. It's still really urgent. 3 years in, oh my God, things are just getting worse. They're still, and just before the Capitol takeover last, what was that, Wednesday? Donald Jr. was talking about, the problems of trans women participating in sports. I mean, that was part of his rally, to upset people, to instill fear. And I kind of want to take that clip and show it to all the TERFs, all the trans radical exclusionary feminists, and be like, this is your team. Like, you're on the team with Donald Jr. if you're trying to keep trans women out of sports. So the urgency doesn't stop. The relevance doesn't stop. And that is horrendous, and it's terrifying. And so this conversation needs to continue to happen. And I'm grateful that we have this tool with disclosure to bring the conversation into so many different types of organizations, right? That we can have conversations with people, with lawyers and judges. Like lawyers at the ACLU have told us that they've watched disclosure in order to prepare arguments for, when they're preparing an argument to defend a client. A group of California judges told us that they watched clips from from Disclosure to educate each other about the biases they might hold towards trans people in the courtroom. I've gone in to do DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion trainings with like Fidelity or, healthcare groups. Even Netflix brought me in, so, and then we're creating toolkits for all these groups. We're educating for, high school students and college students. And so to have this tool right now, I mean, we're doing as much as we can to use disclosure to, inform these conversations in so many sectors that are crucial for trans people to survive right now and to not feel as alienated as so many people want us to feel. And continue to have to fight, for better or for worse, for our rights, from healthcare, right? There's like all these threats on denying healthcare for trans people, to participating in public life, from bathrooms to sports. This upcoming summer, if hopefully the Olympics will be held, it will be the first time out trans athletes will compete. And meanwhile, we're still having discussions around whether high school students can compete.
Or younger, or even younger. It's not even just about high school kids who are trans. It's middle school and junior high. And it's very disturbing. And I was very reluctant for a very long time to talk about sports, because I'm not a person to talk about sports, first of all. And it's this very contentious kind of issue. And I had a conversation with Chris Mosier, who is a brilliant athlete. He is the first openly trans person to sort of compete for Team America. He's a duathlete, and he's really wonderful. And we had this lovely conversation last year for Trans Day of Visibility about the sort of attack on trans children in sports. And he can speak to this so much more brilliantly than I can. But I think it's important to note, I've noted many times that the sort of federal attempts to limit the rights of trans people from I don't like to say his name, from the 45th presidential administration. But it's really important to note that even prior to the current president, who's going to be leaving very soon, there were many attempts at the state level, and there continue to be many attempts from state legislatures, from bathrooms, and famously in 2016 in North Carolina, and now there's a slew of laws pending in state legislatures all over the country. One in my home state of Alabama, which is very distressing. This is not the first time that are targeting. For a while, it was bathrooms. Now it's targeting children and healthcare for trans children and access to teams and team sports. And it's utterly distressing, because I think on the healthcare piece, what I know for sure is that in America, we do not want the government, and we should not want the government involved in any healthcare decisions that we're making between us and our doctors. And when it comes to children, those decisions should be made between the parent, a doctor, and the child themselves. And we should have nothing to do with it. Some of these laws will out trans kids in schools. Schools will we mandated for schools to sort of out trans youth when they might not be ready to their parents and other people. And it's just so whenever we think about, I mean, if you think about something, another condition, right? If you think about, if a child has cancer or has some fatal illness or something, or terminal illness or chronic illness, you would not want the government involved in something that may or may not jeopardize the health of your child, right? The government should not be involved in that. And that's just really that simple. And when it comes to sports, there are all these questions around if there's an advantage or if there's not an advantage. And there have been standards in place. I think there are two things I would say, but there have been standards in place from speaking of the Olympic Committee has had standards in place, particularly everyone's really concerned about trans women competing, not trans men. There have been standards in place since I think 2002, and they're very strict standards for adults. And then for a lot of those standards don't even apply for preteen children who haven't even gone through puberty yet. And we're sort of making all of these kind of crazy assumptions about advantage and disadvantage. And I think it's something that the government should not really be involved in ultimately. But it really, again, is about scapegoating trans people, stigmatizing trans people, using us as this wedge issue and dehumanizing us when we are coming forward more and more and more and insisting on our humanity. And I think a lot of this is because we deal with this sort of tension and disclosure where we're more visible and now we're more targeted. And it really is unfortunately, that is the reality of that is playing out in a really unfortunate way. It is devastating that 2020 is the year that disclosure premiered to the world, and it's also the year that more trans people have been murdered globally. And I'm just like, there's a global pandemic and we're still like, murders against us are still escalating. And I'm like, what? I just I'm at a loss for words when I think about it.
I wanted to bring up one other topic that is explored in the film that is of great interest to us at the ACLU, and that is issues around sex work and trans people being portrayed as sex workers, profiled as sex workers, having the stigma around that and the criminalization of sex work play into some of these other dynamics like economic marginalization and violence. Could you speak to how that became part of the film and why that was an important piece of the story to tell?
Sam, do you have thoughts on that?
Oh, that's a lot. It's
a lot.
I mean, on like a very basic level, I think again, it's like, how could you not include that in the film about the history of trans representation? That has been one of the longest going tropes that we've seen that reduce trans women to doing sex work. And I think for a lot of us, it's complicated because, well, I speak for myself. I mean, trans women do sex work. Trans men do sex work. Trans people do sex work. And that's not the problem. The problem is when that's all you see in representation again and again, and, just reducing someone's existence to one opportunity, right? And then on top of that, the stories you see around sex workers are usually about them being killed or them being psychotic, right? I mean, you see Candace Cain talking about how, there's that episode where I think it's in CSI where she was killed. And she was like, I've died so many times, I can't count anymore. And we weren't able to keep this in the film, but she tells the story about how in the script, they had her killed in the men's room. And so she at least got them to kill her in the women's room. So they, shoved her head in the women's toilet rather than the men's, it's just, it's mind boggling, the depth of violence that is not only written into our lives, right, but is that highlighted. So, there's so much to talk about regarding trans women, regarding sex work, but it's such a huge go-to in storytelling. And one of the things I feel that I noticed early on was this utter lack of creativity, and, just this need to kind of lean on this cliche, whether it was the sex worker or a trans person being the butt of a joke, and it tells you so much more about the people behind the scenes, right, than about trans people.
Absolutely. The thing, I mean, there's so much I have to say about this too, but I at one point I calculated that I have played a sex worker on screen 7 different times. And I remember one day, many years ago, it was very rare that I had 3 auditions in one day, but I had 3 auditions in one day. This was, I think around 2008 or 9 or something like that. And I had 3 auditions in one day, and all of them were for sex workers. And I remember sort of being on the subway, and I was like, I'm going to make every sex worker different. And I've never, and for me, it's not about, I've not ever had an issue playing a sex worker because I believe everyone is a human being, despite what they might have to do for a living. And so I've tried to make every sex worker different and try to infuse humanity whenever possible, if the script allowed for that. So there's that piece of it. And I think there is the piece of sex work has been coming up a lot in my life over the past week. And I think there's also the piece of the lived experiences, right? That there are really complicated experiences that trans people have around sex work. For a very long time, it was the only option that a lot of trans folks felt they had around employment. We know that the unemployment rate in the trans community is 3 times the national average, 4 times that for trans people of color. And so sex work has been the only option for some trans people. Some trans people choose sex work. There's myriad different reasons why folks end up in sex work. But I think there's the representation piece and wanting to show that that's not all that we do. But then there's also the real lived experiences of my understanding from the Anti-Violence Project is that when folks are involved in any kind of street economy that may be stigmatized or illegal, that they're more likely to experience violence, right? And so then if we acknowledge that sex work is something that has always existed and will always exist, no matter what must we do for sex workers to make them safer, to make their lives better? And I think decriminalizing it would be a really good start so that trans people would be safer. Everyone of all gender identities and expression would be safer doing sex work. But I think that for trans folks in sex work, I'm not saying I don't want to ever see a trans sex worker on screen again, but I think that there are other things that we also do, and that's been true for a very long time.
There's other things that trans people also do, but then if you look at a show, and Laverne, you and I talked about this last week, but a show like Veneno, right? Yeah. Where there is so much, there's so much of the story is about trans women doing sex work, but the story is told with nuance, right? They're not just reduced to a body that's been killed or violated, right? Or that a person who is, mentally ill. So it's, yes, sex work is a big part of the trans community for economic reasons, that Laverne talked about, or choice. And those are things we want to support and in every way possible. But how do we tell these stories with humanity, with nuance, so that we're not reduced to a level of dehumanization? Because once we're dehumanized, we know violence follows.
Yeah. And I think Veneno is such a beautiful example of how you can have the messy reality of a life. A lot of our lives are very messy and are not perfect. And that's what makes a life human. And all of that is there. And it is so insanely and utterly beautiful. I can't speak enough about that project. And I just think it is absolutely amazing and incredible. But I think, the one thing I always want to say too about sex work too, is that it's sex work would not exist without the client, right? So that what I love with Veneno is that the truth of some of the clients who patronize trans women sex workers, that we wouldn't, the business wouldn't flourish as much as it has flourished since it's existed, and trans women have been involved in it all globally, if there were not customers. And it's who are these customers? And can we talk about that? And I think that's a very interesting conversation. But we may be getting off topic a little bit.
Indeed. But as the ACLU gets deeper into advocating for decriminalization of sex work in partnership and collaboration with folks who have been engaged in the sex trade, trans and otherwise, really appreciate the efforts y'all are making to tell those stories in nuanced ways. And I guess that brings me to a final question. Given all that is going on in the world and all the different issues the film addresses, what would you like to see in a post-disclosure world? What kind of changes are you hoping the impact of this film will actually bring about as future films come together?
I love that question. It's a question that came up I was even before Disclosure came out, and I knew it was about to sort of drop. And I was in a meeting about a script, and I was like, I was saying to my collaborators, I was like, I don't think we can have this scene in now in a post-disclosure world, right? So even as a filmmaker on Disclosure, I'm like, now, like, how do we raise the bar, in terms of representation, in terms of who's on the crew? These are conversations I'm having. I think it's, when you're talking with TV networks, and different production companies trying to sort of like incorporate Sam's brilliant model, are questions that are coming up for me in terms of at every level of production when I am a producer on something. I think it makes, I know other people who've watched and have said, we're trying to incorporate this level of the people who are being represented on screen are also represented behind the scenes. And I've had conversations with other people who are making documentaries who are trying to incorporate, even if they're not talking about trans people, they're trying to incorporate our production model. So that's very exciting. I think it's really about, for me, it's like post-disclosure, but it's also post-Veneno. That that there's a bold, I've had many conversations with other creators about, now the bar has been raised again in terms of, I was talking to a trans woman who's a writer yesterday, and she was saying with Veneno has everything I was told you can't do in storytelling when you talk about trans folks. And so that's really exciting. But then you cannot have a Veneno without trans people involved behind the scenes and trans people telling those stories. You cannot tell a story as nuanced as that without having trans folks involved and having like source material that was written by a trans person, for example. So I don't know. I think a lot of it is about continually raising the bar and being more bold and human and messy and complicated in our storytelling.
Which is a beautiful thing.
I mean, it's also just so thrilling and such a great it's such an honor and an opportunity to be able to say, look, we made this film, like we were an indie film team. We made this film. We put our energy in the places that were important to us. Making a film is so hard, but we chose to empower trans people from the beginning. I mean, from the first shoot in January 2018, our gaffer, who was mentoring a fellow gaffer, a trans fellow gaffer, she was so moved by what we were doing and how we were doing it that back then she went to her union, IATSE, which is the largest tech union in the world, and she had conversations with them about how do we streamline membership for new trans members. And she was part of instituting the first trans sensitivity training at IATSE, which has now been, manifested to chapters across the country and perhaps even in other countries. So seeing that domino effect so early on and the potential of change when you put your energy towards where you want to see the change, I think that's really exciting. And being able to now bring these conversations into other industries about their hiring practices, and asking people like, are there trans people in your office and why not? And are you going to go to HR and ask, Are you actually looking for trans people? It's one thing to say like anyone's welcome, apply, but it's another thing to go and do the outreach and really let people know that they're welcome and do the training too, because so many of us have not only felt unwelcome, right, because of overt actions taken upon that, because we don't feel like our jobs are protected or we've been fired for being trans. But we're also intimidated and scared to put ourselves into those places and hold ourselves back from training and opportunities. So organizations need to do that training, right? Like in the way we've shown that it's possible, right? So it's not just about, okay, one day on the job and watch how we're working, but no, bring trans people in, pay them, train them, give them those opportunities if you want to see trans inclusion in the workplace. So having these conversations, I think, outside of the entertainment industry is also the change we want to see going forward after Disclosure.
Thank you both so much for all you have done to advance the telling of authentic trans stories in ways that reach more and more people through Disclosure and beyond.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Amanda.